It was 2018 when I decided to fulfill a long-time dream of mine, hunting deep in the Amazon rainforest. I'd been hunting for years, but most of my experience was in North America: deer, boar, small game. The Amazon had always seemed like the ultimate challenge. With its dense canopy, unpredictable wildlife, and sheer remoteness, it wasn't something you could approach casually. But I thought I was prepared. I was 32 at the time and in pretty good shape. Months of research had gone into this trip. I mapped out the area I'd hunt, gathered the proper permits, and hired a guide to help me navigate the unforgiving terrain. His name was Miguel, and he was a local with years of experience guiding tourists, researchers, and the occasional adventurous hunter like me. Miguel had warned me that the jungle wasn't forgiving, even to seasoned outdoorsmen. I didn't take his warnings lightly, but I felt confident in my abilities. Confidence is a funny thing, necessary for survival but dangerous in excess. We flew into a small village on the edge of the rainforest and spent 2 days gathering supplies. Miguel was insistent that we carry only what was necessary. Every ounce mattered when you were trekking miles into the jungle. My gear included a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for a week, a satellite phone, a hunting rifle, and a machete. Miguel brought his own supplies, including a bow and arrows, which he swore were quieter and better suited for the jungle. By the third morning, we were ready to set out. The village quickly disappeared behind us, swallowed by the dense foliage. The first day of trekking was uneventful, almost serene. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting everything in a greenish gloom. The sounds of the jungle were constant: bird calls, insect chirps, the rustle of leaves. It was humid beyond belief, and the air felt heavy in my lungs. We followed a narrow trail that Miguel assured me was used by locals, though it was barely visible in some places. That night, we set up camp near a small stream. Miguel showed me how to rig a basic shelter using the tarp I'd brought and reinforced it with large leaves and vines. He was efficient, his hands moving with practiced ease. I tried to mirror his movements, but I felt clumsy in comparison. After we'd eaten, Miguel checked the perimeter and suggested we keep a small fire going to ward off animals. We took turns keeping watch, though the night passed without incident. The second day, we moved deeper into the jungle. Miguel had marked an area where he'd spotted peccaries, wild pigs, on previous trips. The hike was grueling. Sweat soaked my clothes, and every step seemed to stir up a new swarm of insects. Miguel, on the other hand, moved like he was born here, barely making a sound. By mid-afternoon, we found signs of game. Tracks in the mud, droppings, even some chewed-up vegetation. Miguel pointed out a faint path leading into thicker brush and suggested we follow it. It was slow going. The trail was overgrown, and we had to hack through parts of it with machetes. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the jungle felt. The air seemed heavier, the sounds sharper, as if the forest were watching us. We set up camp again that night near another stream. This time, Miguel advised against a fire. He said it might scare off game or attract the wrong kind of attention. That night felt different. The jungle seemed louder, more alive. I could hear things moving in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On the third day, we finally spotted a small group of peccaries. Miguel gestured for me to stay quiet as we crept closer. I raised my rifle and lined up a shot, but before I could fire, the animals bolted. Something had spooked them.
Miguel froze, listening intently.
I strained my ears but couldn't hear anything unusual. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. Miguel motioned for us to move, quickly but quietly. We didn't speak. There was no need. The sound came again, closer this time. Whatever it was big and it was following us. My heart pounded as we pushed through the dense brush. Miguel kept looking over his shoulder, his face tense. We didn't stop until we reached a more open area, where the visibility was better. Miguel finally spoke, his voice low and urgent. He believed it was a jaguar, and jaguars were known to stalk their prey for miles. We decided to keep moving until we found a safer spot to set up camp. The sun was setting, and the jungle was growing darker by the minute. I could feel my exhaustion setting in, but the adrenaline kept me going. Just as we were about to stop for the night, we came across something that made my blood run cold. A clearing with the remains of a campsite. The tents were shredded, their fabric hanging in tatters from the surrounding trees. Supplies were scattered everywhere, and there were claw marks on the ground and nearby trees. Miguel inspected the area, his expression grim. He found no signs of bodies, but the scene was enough to unsettle both of us. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't good. We decided to move a little farther before setting up our own camp. That night, neither of us slept much. We kept our weapons close and took turns keeping watch. The jungle felt even more oppressive, the sounds more sinister. Every rustle, every distant call made my heart race. The next morning, we agreed to head back toward the village. The hunt wasn't worth the risk anymore. The trail back seemed harder to follow, as if the jungle had shifted overnight. Miguel seemed uneasy, constantly scanning the trees and underbrush. Around midday, we came across another unsettling sight, a partially eaten carcass of a peccary. It was fresh, the blood still glistening. Miguel examined it and pointed out the jaguar tracks nearby. He said it wasn't normal for a jaguar to leave its kill like this. It was either disturbed or hunting for sport. The rest of the day was a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. By the time we set up camp that night, I was on edge. We decided against a fire again, not wanting to attract attention. I took the first watch, gripping my rifle tightly as I scanned the darkness. Hours passed without incident, and I began to relax. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something brushing against leaves. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Miguel took over the watch, and I tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow menacing. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to Miguel shaking me urgently. He pointed to the trees, and I saw them, eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. They were low to the ground, spaced far apart. The jaguar, it was crouched, watching us. Miguel whispered for me to stay still. Slowly, he reached for his bow, but before he could draw an arrow, the jaguar leaped. What followed was a blur of noise and chaos. Miguel managed to wound the jaguar with an arrow, but it didn't stop. I fired my rifle, the sound deafening in the still night. The jaguar let out a blood-curdling roar before disappearing into the jungle. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing our gear, we moved as quickly as we could in the darkness, not stopping until dawn. By the time we reached the village the next evening, we were exhausted and shaken. I've hunted many times since then, but I've never gone back to the Amazon. There's something about that place, something primal and unforgiving, that still haunts me. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the sounds of the jungle, and for a moment, I'm back there, staring into those eyes, knowing how close I came to never making it out. I signed up for the Border Duty Camp program when I was 28, thinking it would be an adventure. I was in a small, rugged town near the border of New Mexico, working for a private contractor assisting customs agents and law enforcement. The job paid decently, and honestly, I was looking forward to spending time outdoors. I'd grown tired of city life, and the thought of camping under the stars felt like a good change. It was spring 2017, and the nights were still cold. The group I was stationed with wasn't particularly large. Just 4 of us tasked with keeping an eye on a long stretch of fence that bordered the wilderness. There had been reports of increased smuggling activity in the area, mostly at night. Our job was to monitor the area and report anything suspicious to the authorities. We were stationed about 3 miles from the nearest road in a remote outpost. The area was surrounded by rolling hills and sparse vegetation. During the day, it looked almost peaceful, but at night, the vast emptiness turned into something darker, something that made me feel small and exposed. We rotated shifts, and that week, I drew the short straw and got the overnight watch. It was my 2nd week on the job, and I was still getting used to the eerie silence of the desert at night. The others joked that I'd hear coyotes howling or maybe see some weird lights in the distance, but I brushed it off. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent hours sitting in the cold, staring out into the darkness with my binoculars, occasionally hearing the distant call of an owl or the rustle of bushes as small animals moved around. I was armed, of course, a standard-issue pistol and a flashlight. Still, there was something about being so far from civilization that made me uneasy. On the 4th night, things changed. Started around midnight. I was sitting in my folding chair near the edge of the camp, facing the fence line. The moon was out, casting long shadows across the landscape. I was half asleep, sipping on a cup of instant coffee, when I noticed movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal. The figure was far away, just a dark shape moving slowly along the fence line. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on it. It was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that blended into the shadows. I watched him for a while, expecting him to cross the fence or make a run for it, but he didn't. He just stood there looking around. He didn't seem to notice me, or maybe he didn't care. I radioed the others back at the main camp, but they didn't respond. Our radios had a habit of cutting out in certain areas, so I wasn't too surprised. I decided to stay put and keep watching. The man eventually started moving again, walking parallel to the fence, heading in my direction. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, gave me a bad feeling. As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was wearing a hooded jacket, and his face was partially covered. He carried something in his hand, though I couldn't tell what it was. I debated whether to call out to him or try to get closer, but my gut told me to stay where I was. When he was about 200 feet away, he stopped. He stood perfectly still, facing my direction. I froze, unsure if he could see me. My flashlight was off, and I was partially hidden behind some bushes. For a moment, it felt like we were locked in a silent standoff. Then he did something that sent chills down my spine. He raised his arm and pointed directly at me. I don't know how he knew I was there. I hadn't made a sound, and I was well hidden. But he knew. I felt exposed like a rabbit caught in the open. I slowly reached for my flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at him. The beam illuminated his face, and I wish I hadn't looked. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and dark. He didn't look angry or scared, just blank, like a mannequin. He didn't move. He just kept pointing at me. I shouted at him, telling him to leave, but he didn't react. My voice echoed into the night, swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. Then, without warning, he turned and started walking away, heading deeper into the wilderness. I didn't follow him. I didn't want to. Something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong there or anywhere. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the image of his face. When the sun finally came up, I reported what I saw to the others. They laughed it off, saying I'd probably scared off some poor migrant or a lost hiker. But I knew what I saw. For the next few nights, I couldn't relax. Every shadow, Every sound made me jump. I started sleeping with my pistol close at hand, even during the day. A week later, I was moved to a different section of the border. I didn't see the man again, but the feeling he left me with never went away. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. I wonder who or what he was, and I wonder if he's still out there, walking along the fence, waiting for someone else to see him. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 15 years old. My grandfather, Harold, decided to take me and his ex-wife, Darlene, on a camping trip to a remote part of northern Montana. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. I didn't know Darlene well, and the thought of spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere with her felt awkward. But my grandfather, always the outdoorsman, was excited, and his enthusiasm was hard to resist. He said he wanted to teach me survival skills and show me a few of his favorite spots from his younger days. We loaded up his old Ford Bronco with supplies: sleeping bags, a tent, fishing rods, and enough food to last a week. The drive was long, almost 7 hours, but the scenery was beautiful. We passed through small towns, thick forests, and winding mountain roads. Granddad talked most of the way, sharing stories from his youth, while Darlene sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. When we finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The campsite was at the edge of a dense forest near a wide, slow-moving river. There were no other people in sight, just us and the wilderness. Granddad picked the spot carefully, choosing a flat area close to the water, but far enough from the trees to avoid falling branches. We set up camp quickly. Granddad showed me how to pitch the tent while Darlene gathered firewood. She didn't say much, but she worked fast, and before long, we had a good pile of wood and a fire crackling in the stone ring. That first night, we ate canned chili and roasted marshmallows under a sky full of stars. Granddad told more stories, mostly about his time in the army and his early days with Darlene. She laughed a little, but I could tell there was tension between them. Still, they managed to keep things civil. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds and the smell of bacon frying over the fire. Granddad was up early, as always, and had already caught a few fish for breakfast. Darlene was sitting by the fire, sipping coffee and looking tired. The day was spent exploring. Granddad led us on a hike through the forest, pointing out animal tracks and edible plants. We found a small waterfall hidden in the woods and spent some time there, enjoying the cool mist and the sound of rushing water. It was peaceful, and for a while I forgot about the awkwardness of the trip. Things took a turn that evening. As we were getting ready for dinner, I noticed something strange. A few of our supplies were missing. Nothing major, just a couple of cans of food and a flashlight. I mentioned it to Granddad, and he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just misplaced. The second night was colder, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees around us. I had trouble sleeping and kept hearing noises outside the tent. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant thud. Granddad assured me it was just the wind or animals moving around, but it didn't feel right. The next morning, we found more things missing: a knife, some rope, and a few packets of instant oatmeal. This time, Granddad looked concerned. He said it might be raccoons or some other animals, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We decided to stay close to camp that day. Granddad and I spent the morning fishing while Darlene stayed near the tent, reading a book. Around noon, I thought I saw something or someone on the opposite side of the river. It was just a shadow moving through the trees, but it didn't look like an animal. I told Granddad, and he scanned the area with his binoculars but didn't see anything. That evening, the atmosphere was tense. Granddad kept glancing toward the woods, and Darlene seemed more withdrawn than usual. We ate dinner in near silence, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. As night fell, Granddad decided to set up a makeshift alarm system using some fishing line and empty cans. He strung it around the perimeter of the campsite, hoping it would alert us if anything or anyone came too close. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining someone or something creeping around outside the tent. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard the sound of cans rattling. Granddad was up in an instant, grabbing his flashlight and stepping outside. I followed, my heart pounding. Darlene stayed in the tent, clutching her sleeping bag. The flashlight beam swept across the campsite, revealing nothing but the trees and the empty space where our fire had burned out. The fishing line had been broken in one spot, and a few cans were scattered on the ground. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. Granddad stayed awake, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his lap. I sat with him for a while, but eventually went back to the tent, though I didn't sleep. The next morning, Granddad decided it was time to pack up and leave. He didn't say much, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Darlene didn't argue. She just started gathering her things. As we were packing, I noticed something strange on the edge of the campsite. There were footprints in the dirt, large and human. They weren't Granddad's or mine, and they definitely weren't Darlene's. I pointed them out to Granddad, and his face went pale. We left in a hurry, loading up the Bronco and driving out of there as fast as we could. The ride home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us. Granddad never talked about it again, and Darlene stopped coming on camping trips altogether. I still go camping sometimes, but I'm always on edge, always watching the woods, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. It started with a simple idea. I needed to do some research for a paper on survival medicine in isolated areas. The idea was to drive deep into a remote forest, camp for a couple of days, and test some techniques I'd read about. I'd always been the type to plan everything to the smallest detail, and this trip was no different. I mapped out a route to a lesser-known forest preserve, packed all the essentials, and even made sure to have a backup GPS alongside the usual map and compass. The forest I chose was in northern Michigan, an area known for its dense trees and lack of cell service. I wasn't looking for anything too popular. Crowds defeated the purpose of my research. This place was perfect. Miles of rugged dirt roads leading to an isolated campsite by a lake. I was 29, in good shape and confident I could handle the trip alone. I left on a crisp morning in October 2021, with the fall colors just starting to show. The drive up was peaceful, the roads becoming rougher and narrower as I got closer to the site. Eventually, the asphalt turned to gravel, and the gravel became dirt. By the time I reached the forest's edge, I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. When I arrived at the campsite, it was exactly as I'd imagined. Secluded, quiet, and surrounded by towering trees. The lake was a few hundred yards away, shimmering through the gaps in the foliage. I set up my tent near the tree line and organized my gear: a first aid kit, a portable stove, a small axe, and a couple of medical books I planned to reference during my experiments. The first day went smoothly. I practiced stitching on a piece of pork belly I'd brought along, set up a makeshift splint from branches, and tested a few improvised bandages using moss and tree sap. It was satisfying work, and by the time the sun set, I felt accomplished. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest. That night, however, I noticed something odd. I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like footsteps outside my tent. They weren't heavy, more like soft crunches on the dry leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. I stayed still, heart pounding, straining to hear more. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I convinced myself it was just an animal and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I brushed off the incident. I focused on my research, hiking around the area to collect plants and practice identifying edible versus toxic ones. I came across a few old trails, clearly not maintained for years. There were no signs of other campers, no trash, no fire pits, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. It was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The forest was so dense that shadows played tricks on my vision, and I told myself it was just my imagination. That evening, as I cooked dinner by the fire, I noticed something else. The woods had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The unease from the previous night returned, stronger this time. I decided to keep my axe within arm's reach and double-checked that my bear spray was in my pocket. When I went to bed, I made sure to zip the tent tightly and keep my flashlight close. I lay there for hours, listening, my ears tuned to every little noise. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. It was faint, almost like a hand lightly dragging across the fabric. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, the wind, maybe a branch had fallen. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those. The sound was too deliberate, too controlled. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The next morning, I found footprints around my tent. They were human, barefoot, and larger than my own. The tracks circled my campsite and led off into the woods. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there watching me while I slept. I debated packing up and leaving, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to abandon the trip. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some local messing around, or maybe the footprints weren't even fresh. I decided to stay one more night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. That day, I stayed close to camp, not wanting to stray too far. I kept my axe in hand the entire time and made sure to check my surroundings constantly. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put me on edge. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I built a larger fire that night, hoping it would deter whoever or whatever was out there. As I sat by the flames, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a figure just on the edge of the firelight. I stood up, shining my flashlight in the direction, but saw nothing. The night was long. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent, gripping the axe, jumping at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The soft crunch of footsteps, closer this time. Then came a low, guttural sound, a noise that didn't quite sound human. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys, threw on my boots, and bolted for the car. I didn't bother packing up my gear. I just wanted to get out of there. As I started the engine and turned on the headlights, I saw it. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he didn't move as I sped away. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached a motel miles away. It wasn't until the safety of daylight that I realized just how close I'd come to something I still can't explain. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found no trace of the man or my gear when they checked the site. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing: I'll never camp alone again. The trip was supposed to be straightforward. A quick camping retreat with my general manager, Mark, to discuss upcoming strategies for the company's fiscal year. Mark had always been a fan of mixing business with a bit of the outdoors. He'd say the fresh air cleared his mind and helped him focus. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea. My idea of relaxation was a weekend in front of the TV, not pitching a tent in the middle of nowhere. But Mark insisted, and when your boss insists, you don't say no. We left early on a Friday morning in his SUV, packed with all the camping essentials he'd meticulously prepared. Mark was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a booming voice that commanded respect. I was 29, still climbing the corporate ladder, and couldn't afford to miss an opportunity to impress. The drive out to the state forest took about 4 hours. The sun was bright, and the roads were empty, winding through small towns and stretches of dense woodland. Mark was in a good mood, chatting about projections and client outreach. I nodded along, only half listening, my thoughts on the weekend ahead. When we finally reached the forest, Mark parked in a gravel lot at the trailhead. The area was remote, far from the typical campsites families frequented. He said he knew a spot a few miles in that was quiet and isolated, perfect for uninterrupted brainstorming. We strapped on our backpacks and started the hike. The trail was uneven and overgrown, with fallen branches and thick underbrush encroaching on the path. The air was humid, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every step feel heavier. Birds chirped overhead, and occasionally we'd hear the rustle of leaves as small animals darted away. About 3 miles in, Mark veered off the trail. "It's just through here," he said as he led the way into the trees. The underbrush was dense, and I had to duck and push branches aside as we made our way deeper into the forest. After another half-mile, we reached a small clearing. It was surrounded by tall pines and completely silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "This is it," Mark announced. We dropped our packs and got to work setting up camp. Mark's efficiency was impressive. Within an hour, we had 2 tents set up, a fire pit dug, and a makeshift workspace arranged with folding chairs and a small table. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we settled in around the fire. Mark had brought steaks, which we cooked over the flames, along with some canned beans. The food was surprisingly good, and for a moment I almost forgot about the work ahead. That night I barely slept. The ground was hard despite the sleeping pad, and every noise outside the tent seemed amplified in the darkness. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Each sound set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy moving through the underbrush, but when I held my breath and listened, it was gone. The next morning, we got to work. Mark was all business, spreading out charts and talking through strategies. The hours dragged on as the sun climbed higher, baking the clearing in relentless heat. By afternoon, we were both drenched in sweat and frustrated. Mark suggested a break, so we decided to explore the area a bit. We ventured deeper into the forest, leaving markers on trees to ensure we could find our way back. The woods were dense, and the further we went, the more oppressive it felt. The air was thick, and the sunlight barely pierced through the canopy. About a mile in, we came across something strange. A dilapidated shack, almost entirely hidden by vines and overgrowth. It looked old, with weathered wooden planks and a sagging roof. Mark, ever the curious type, decided to investigate. I stayed back, uneasy. Something about the place felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Mark pushed the door open with a creak and stepped inside. I hesitated before following, peeking through the doorway. The interior was empty except for a rusted metal bed frame and a pile of debris in one corner. The air inside was stale, and the floor creaked ominously underfoot. We didn't stay long. Mark shrugged it off as an old hunting cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't have been there. As we made our way back to camp, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. That night, the forest felt different. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Even Mark seemed on edge, though he didn't say anything. I lay awake in my tent, staring at the ceiling and listening. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, distant rumble. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was all around us. It was deep and rhythmic, like heavy machinery or a distant drumbeat. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Mark was already up, standing by the fire pit, his face pale in the flickering light. The sound was coming from the direction of the shack, pulsed through the air, vibrating in my chest. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice low and firm. We quickly packed up what we could, leaving behind anything that wasn't essential. The noise grew louder, almost deafening, as we started back toward the trail. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like shadows. Halfway back, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. Every step felt like it echoed, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. When we finally reached the parking lot, Mark's SUV was the only vehicle there. We threw our gear in the back and got in, slamming the doors shut. Mark started the engine and we sped off without a word. As we drove away, I looked back toward the forest. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. We never spoke about what happened. Mark canceled all future camping retreats, and I avoided the subject entirely. But every now and then, I hear that sound in my dreams. A low, rhythmic rumble that fills me with a sense of dread I can't explain. I still don't know what it was or why it seemed to follow us, but one thing is certain. I'll never step foot in those woods again. It's been over a decade since that camping trip, but I still can't bring myself to step foot in the woods. I was 27 at the time, and camping was my favorite way to unwind. There was something about leaving the noise of the city behind and finding solace in the quiet of the forest that always called to me. I'd been on countless solo trips before, but this one changed everything. It was late spring 2013. The days were warm, and the nights carried just enough chill to make a campfire cozy. I'd planned a 3-day trip to a remote area in the Appalachian foothills in Alabama. It was far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't run into any casual day hikers, but not so isolated that it felt dangerous. I'd picked the spot from an online forum where outdoor enthusiasts shared their favorite hidden gems. A small clearing by a stream, surrounded by dense trees, seemed perfect. I parked my car at the trailhead around midday, loaded my pack with supplies, and started the 3-mile hike to the campsite. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but that only added to its charm. The sound of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot were the only noises accompanying me. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. It was everything I'd hoped for. The stream babbled softly nearby, and the trees formed a protective canopy around the open space. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and prepared for a relaxing evening. Dinner was a simple affair, dehydrated noodles and jerky, but it tasted like a feast under the open sky. As the fire crackled, I leaned back against a log, letting the peace of the forest wash over me. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly, lulled by the rhythmic sounds of the stream. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a couple of miles, noting how it twisted and turned through the landscape. At one point, I stumbled across an old, rusted car half buried in the undergrowth. It looked like it had been there for decades, and nature had all but reclaimed it. The sight was eerie but fascinating. I snapped a few photos with my phone before moving on. When I returned to camp, I noticed something odd. My fire pit, which I'd carefully arranged the night before, looked disturbed. The stones were scattered, and the ashes had been shifted. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it, but there weren't any tracks around to confirm that. Shrugging it off, I rebuilt the fire pit and went about my day. That evening, as the sun set, the forest seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. The usual chorus of insects and birds was absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone out here, and the isolation could mess with anyone's head. I stayed up later than usual, tending the fire and keeping an ear out for any unusual sounds. Around midnight, I finally crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the trees and rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke suddenly to the sound of something, or someone, walking outside. The steps were slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves just beyond the light of my dying fire. My mouth went dry, and my pulse pounded in my ears. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The steps circled my tent once, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I reached for the knife I always kept in my pack and held it tightly. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for something to happen. Finally, I mustered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire's embers cast a faint glow, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was dark, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. Convinced I was just being paranoid, I zipped the tent back up and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. They were human, unmistakably so, and they weren't mine. They circled my tent, wandered over to the fire pit, and then disappeared into the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at them. Someone had been out there watching me. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit how shaken I was. Instead, I decided to stay one more night but kept my knife on me at all times. I spent the day gathering more firewood and making sure everything in my camp was secure. As the sun began to set, I built the largest fire I could manage, hoping it would deter anyone or anything from approaching. That night, the forest was silent again. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, scanning the trees for any movement. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the woods. The steps were heavier this time, more deliberate. They stopped just out of sight, and I could feel the weight of eyes on me. I called out, my voice shaky, but there was no response. Instead, the steps began again, slower now, moving closer. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated trees and undergrowth. The steps stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, gripping my knife and flashlight, listening to every sound. When the first light of day broke through the trees, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. The hike back to my car was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was relieved to see my car untouched. I threw my gear in the back and sped out of there, not looking back once. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the highway, that I felt like I could breathe again. I never reported the incident. What would I have said? That someone walked around my campsite? It wasn't illegal to be in the woods, and I didn't have any proof that they meant me harm. But I know what I felt out there. Whoever or whatever was watching me didn't have good intentions. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel like a refuge anymore. Instead, they remind me of that night, of the footsteps circling my tent, and of the feeling that I was never truly alone. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. The weather had been unpredictable, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to the outdoors, comfortable being alone in nature, and confident I could handle whatever the forest threw at me. I picked a spot about 2 hours outside of town, a dense patch of woods near a small lake. I'd been there once before with friends, but this time, I wanted to experience it alone. I loaded up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a couple of days, and some essentials like a flashlight, knife, and first aid kit. The forecast had mentioned some light rain, but it didn't seem like a big deal. I threw in my raincoat and figured I'd be fine. The drive out there was peaceful. The trees were just starting to turn shades of red and orange, and the road wound through hills that seemed endless. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, it was mid-afternoon. The sun was tucked behind thick clouds, but the air was cool and smelled of damp leaves. I parked my truck, strapped on my pack, and set off into the woods. The trail was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of squirrels or the distant call of a bird. I took my time, enjoying the solitude. After about an hour, I reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing near the lake, surrounded by towering pines. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles, and the water lapped gently at the shore. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the lake to hear the water but far enough to avoid any flooding if the rain picked up. After that, I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the evening wore on, the sky darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. At first, it was light, just a soft patter on the tent. I zipped myself inside, listening to the rain as I read a book by flashlight. It was cozy, almost comforting. But as the hours passed, the rain grew heavier. By midnight, it was pouring. The wind picked up, shaking the trees and howling through the forest. I tried to sleep, but the noise kept me awake. My tent held up against the rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the weather, it was the way the forest felt. There was an eerie stillness, like the animals had all fled. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain and the occasional creak of a tree. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a loud cracking sound. My heart raced as I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight. The sound came again, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking. It was close, maybe just outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. Another snap, followed by a rustling noise. It wasn't the wind. Something or someone was out there. I reached for my knife, clutching it tightly as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The darkness was almost absolute. My flashlight barely penetrated the sheets of rain. I swept the beam across the clearing, but nothing seemed out of place. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the forest was pitch black. I closed the tent, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump, and sleep was impossible. The hours dragged on, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again, a crack, closer this time. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the wet leaves. I froze, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing right there. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The rain masked a lot of the noise, but I thought I heard breathing. Then, without warning, the footsteps moved away, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed up my gear and left. The trail back to the truck felt longer than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd stop and look back, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was drenched, exhausted, and more than a little spooked. I tossed my gear into the truck, climbed in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, watching me leave. It wasn't until I got home that I realized how strange it all was. The footsteps, the snapping branches, it couldn't have been an animal. And if it was another person, why were they out there in the middle of a storm, creeping around my tent? I never went back to that campsite. Even now, years later, the memory of that night still makes my skin crawl. Sometimes, when it rains, I find myself listening for those footsteps, wondering what or who was out there with me.